Okay, let's get started. So, hello everyone. Oh, the moment I said hello, I'm not exactly sure. Oh, it's over there. Okay, perfect. I was like, I did nothing different.
It's one of those flimsy walls.
Ah, it's a fake wall. Okay. So normally I stand up. I'm a little restless sitting down, but they're encouraging me to use the microphone because this is being videotaped, and this is where the slides are. So I might do a little bit of sitting here, but then bouncing around a bit. Welcome. I was saying the concurrent session game is really intense today. There's like 7 other presentations that are all very compelling. So I'm really excited to see all of you here. My name is Caroline Mulia. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I'm the co-associate dean for collections at the University of Southern California in Los Angeles, USC. And only in South Carolina do people say, oh, that USC, because there's a much more exciting University of South Carolina here, and I often get mistaken for an employee there. So today I'll be talking about, hold on for a sec, I just started, is that okay? Okay, great. So today I'll be talking about 2 IMLS projects that I have been part of that are really focused on measuring reuse and just the topic and concept and definition of reuse of digital library collections and in the collection development context. So before I start, I'll say that all of the work that our project teams have done since 2015 are found in our project repository. We use an OSF repository. This is the blog that we maintain, and whenever we are on social media, we try to use the hashtag #DigReuse. The work that I'll be presenting today is in large part supported by the IMLS, the Institute of Museum and Library Services, as well as the Digital Library Federation. So I'd like to thank them before we get started. Okay, so let's start with a story. It's early, it's Wednesday. Let's say you're a digital librarian. Do we actually have any digital librarian practitioners in the room today?
Oh, is everybody a digital librarian?
Oh, good question. So I'm thinking more of people whose main job it is to work in digital primary resources, digital collections, digital assets, that kind of work, as opposed to the commodity collection or the stuff that we're buying from vendors where a lot of electronic resources lives, right? Librarians. So let's say you're a digital librarian and you're working in a digital library, and you do a lot, but part of what you do is you collect stats to demonstrate, and these are terms that'll come up a lot in this presentation, value, impact, significance of the work that you're doing, the collections that you are stewarding, and the users that you're engaging with. Maybe you're consulting Google Analytics, which is a very popular commercially available platform that a lot of librarians use to track and analyze basic statistics. Maybe you're using other commercial platforms, but really you're producing these glamorous and sexy, colorful reports that again are demonstrating that value at some intervals. Maybe you're producing monthly reports for internal users, maybe you're producing annual reports for stakeholders or funding agencies. This is part of the work that you're doing as a digital librarian in 2019 today. But you have this nagging feeling that you're missing something. You're producing these reports, you're accessing this information, but it's not telling the whole story. Because sometimes when people come to the digital library, they are downloading a song that they're then remixing into a different song, right? A song that remixes one that's originally found in your digital library. Or maybe there's a Facebook promotion, let's say for a nonprofit, that centralizes images from that were originally associated with your digital library. Or maybe you find a unique data set that HathiTrust included using some of the data that was originally living or housed in your digital library. So are these examples of use of materials, or are they examples of reuse of materials? And spoiler alert here, you don't have to know the answer because we've spent 4 years interrogating this very question. So when it comes to reuse statistics, which we'll talk about, how do these statistics demonstrate a new dimension of your digital assets? How do you collect them if places like Google Analytics and other commercially available platforms might not be collecting that stuff for you? And what exactly are you collecting? Generally, we capture use and folks in the galleries, libraries, archives, museums, repositories, we refer to them as glamour institutions. We are really good at capturing use statistics. But what about reuse? So that's what we'll talk about today. I'll start with some definitions in part because they've been really tricky for us, and I want to kind of give you the information and equip you with the working definitions that we have, and then I'll kind of go through the work that we've done and with hope leave some time for a question and answer session. So to start, when we first started this project, and which I'll get into, and I'm just right now delivering the definitions, we started with this definition of use. When we think of use in not just a digital library context, but in libraries, we think of discovery and browsing objects in a digital library or elsewhere, often described as clicks or downloads. And in our libraries, have we done this, like how many clicks or how many downloads to ebooks or to, right, I'm thinking of the electronic resources folks in the room. The kind of highlight here is the clicks and downloads and that discoverability is without knowing the specific context for this use. So I deal a lot in assessment, and I run a lot of reports on, let's say, Taylor and Francis. I know there's Taylor and Francis person in there, but Taylor and Francis ebooks, and I download those reports, and I'm like, okay, great, we've got like 2,000 downloads or page views on these Taylor and Francis ebooks, and I can tell a really kind of quick story about my return on investment. I spent $100 on this ebook, and look how many downloads I got just in 1 month. This is a really simple story and a compelling story to tell, and one that a lot of us tell all the time. In the digital library context, some of these examples of use are web traffic information or IP address locations, even referrals from specific sites. How are people getting to our site, and where are they going once they leave our site? And this is sort of the canon of usage statistics and the dimension of use that many people capture, and we'll get into some of those details. Here's the definition of reuse that we came up with early on as a working definition. How often and in what ways digital library materials are utilized and repurposed. And in this definition, the highlight that I have here is that we know the context of the use. So where use is, we have these downloads, we have these clicks, we have these visitors to our site with no context, which we can tell a great story. The reuse piece is we know the context now. What do we do with it? And here's some examples of reuse, where citation metrics, inclusion of digital collection materials in an external data set, remixing songs, sharing on social media. This is what we originally defined and the parameters that we set for this idea of reuse. Okay, so now I'm going to back all the way up and say there are three kind of main points of our project team and the work that we've done to start digging into this. So now that you know the definitions, I'm going to back up again and kind of start from the beginning, which is in 2015, the Digital Library Federation's Assessment Interest Group was a bunch of people from all over the Digital Library Federation, all over the United States and Canada. We released a white paper. This white paper, surveying the landscape, found really promising assessment developments in the area of assessment and digital libraries. And we really focused on areas of usability, return on investment, this really important word that we are hearing all the time, and then reuse. And these kind of three avenues we explored through an environmental scan. It was a very big project and a really exciting white paper to release. And we found a lot of promising opportunities, but we also identified some deficiencies in this process of researching and writing this white paper. And here's what we found, and these were our white paper findings from 2015. We found that traditional assessment analytics, these kind of use analytics, really focus on simple access statistics, which is great because we need them to tell a compelling story of the work that we're doing. But what we found was that there weren't a lot of nuances or granularity in how different communities utilize or transform, what ended up being a key word, transform library-hosted materials from digital libraries. We also found that there was a lack of standardization in assessment methods that impact glamour organizations, an inability to build infrastructure or even collections that responded to user needs or that were based on user needs. We found that people are having difficulty developing appropriate funding models, whether that's for staffing or to support expanding collections that are related to supporting the research and the teaching and the learning that are happening in our universities. And then again, that word impact, that there was a real inability to show impact, where the traditional usage statistics were really helpful in some ways, but they were really, they were hindering us in other ways in telling the full story. So, pause here. So we made several recommendations in this white paper, including the development of a toolkit of best practices that would really help unify future studies and discussions of this kind of murky topic at this point called reuse in the digital library field. And so in 2017, a smaller group then wrote the white paper. It would have just been a circus had we all gotten involved. But 6 of us got together and received an IMLS grant based on our 2015 findings. And this is, sort of keeps happening, where in 2015 we did an environmental scan, in 2017 we relied on what happened before to get a grant, and in 2019 we relied on what happened in 2017 to get a grant. So it just is very iterative, the work that we've done. So in 2017 we received an IMLS grant called Developing a Framework for Measuring Reuse of Digital Objects. It was a 1-year National Forum grant. And this was a project team. We are all over the United States at this point, and these were the 6 of us that got together and spent a year thinking about this concept of reuse. We also had an advisory board, and they were instrumental in helping shape our work and also the deliverables. These were really heavy-hitting, great people in the field, and so we were just so fortunate to be able to work with them. So what did we do with this IMLS grant? We talked to a lot of people. The main thing that we did with this 1-year grant was we talked over and over and over again to lots of people. The main objective of this grant was to conduct a formal needs assessment, and we had these 2 main mechanisms for capturing the community voice. The first one was a Qualtrics-administered online survey. There were 2 of them that we used to capture these initial perspectives on reuse. And then in the second survey, which was towards the end of our grant cycle, we engaged the community, these digital library practitioners, once again, and asked them to prioritize and rank the work that we had collected and analyzed to ensure that our focus really aligned with the biggest needs and biggest priorities of the community. So already you're seeing a lot of the work is just going out and saying, we are the ambassadors of this information, we want to do the work to figure out what reuse means to you and how we collect it. But we need your help and we need your expertise, and people really did come through, and it was incredible. We really wanted to examine the broad barriers that make reuse assessment challenging for practitioners, right? The term reuse is not new. People have been doing this for a while, so why is it so challenging? Why is it not as pervasive as usage statistics? And through these conversations and through these survey responses, we developed use cases that would become the basis of our second grant. So what did we learn from this grant? We learned that 80% of the digital library practitioners, the community, captured usage data. So that term of discovering and browsing without knowing the context, right? 80% of you did that. Only 20% did not, and there were lots of reasons for that. The reason that people collected usage statistics to begin with wasn't because someone else did it so they should do it, but really it was these 4 points. They wanted to improve their digital collection services. And for those of you who are not in the digital library space but are in the collection space, to improve collection services is why I collect usage statistics generally, right? To improve collection selection decisions, so this is that collection development piece. People wanted to see usage statistics so that they knew the collection development decisions to make in the future. Basically, how am I going to spend my money next fiscal year? People use those statistics to demonstrate impact of collections on scholarship and research. So again, I think my acquisitions dollars are being spent towards buying things or licensing things that are supporting research and scholarship and learning at my university or my institution, but I'm not sure. But usage statistics really help give light to that. And then of course to prove return on investment, especially in a world of shrinking budgets, I am spending my acquisitions dollars so well and they're completely uplifting the work that's happening around me. The most common platforms that were used, the Google Analytics was by far the most popular platform. Some content management platform statistics like Drupal, etc. Those were also used, but I would say Google Analytics was the most. And we also learned that people, the most common data that our practitioners collected was number of visitors, number of downloads, and number of clicks. And that was kind of like the big 3 over and over and over again. There was a long tail of other things, but those were the really big 3. So to that same group, we then said, okay, 80% of you collect usage stats, that's amazing. What about reuse? 40% of our community captures reuse statistics or reuse data, and 60% did not. The most common methods for collecting reuse statistics for the 40% that do collect them were social media metrics, alert services, and reverse image lookup. And the most common data that they collected were citations and scholarship, people are doing a lot of that, published or reposted digital objects, and published or replicated print books or physical media. But the real sticking point was that 60% of us are not collecting reuse stats. We're not even in that space. We're still in the use space. So then we asked, of those of you who are collecting reuse statistics, what are some examples? And so this is probably small for you, but I can name some of them. This is the list of reuse areas or reuse statistics that our community came up with. Examples of reuse of digital library assets are in social media, in digital exhibits, in scholarly citations, in presentations, in genealogical research, in Wikipedia citations, and marketing materials, and even news stories. So this is the example that the community came up with. And it's added to, right? This is not a static list. So when we asked people why they didn't gather reuse data, practitioners cited the lack of an accepted methodology for gathering and or interpreting that reuse data. So we're not sure what to gather, how to gather it, and then once we have it, how are we supposed to interpret or analyze it? How is it different than use? They also cited a lack of staffing and time as a significant barrier. So if any of you in the room have done focus groups or surveys of your peers, staff, time, and resources, staff, time, resources, money are like the big ones, right? That's what it is. There's not enough staff, there's not enough money, there are not enough hours in the day, we haven't been trained up. Those things kept coming up over and over again as significant barriers. Practitioners really wanted to do more assessment, but they felt that documented standards would be really the best way to support that assessment work. People wanted standards, they wanted recommended practices, they wanted a guide to show how to do this. I do too, I always want that. And they reported needing technologies that functioned across platforms. And this was really important, and it came up later too. Things that were simple to implement and that were reliable. So what we found over and over were people that were saying, well, we use this sort of open source, kind of neat platform, but then it wasn't reliable, or the training was a pretty steep learning curve, so we never actually got around to it. So we just heard story and story after that, and we realized that people wanted something that was simple to implement and that was reliable. And they also wanted more training on data interpretation and communicating the results. So it was all of these points. It was gathering it, interpreting and analyzing it, and also how do I communicate it? How do I share it with my stakeholders? This was really important. And then one more thing that's not on here that comes up later is people expressed a lot of concern about patron privacy. I mean, we collect a lot of data in libraries, universities, and other institutions collect a lot of data about people that are wandering around at all times, right? So there was really a desire for thoughtful consideration about the ethical implications of data collection. And those were kind of the barriers, but also the opportunities that we saw as a group. So I chose this quote just as sort of a quick capture of from one of the focus group participants, because it really captured so many of the issues that we saw over and over again in speaking to the community. This person said collating data from digital collections, the use and or the reuse, this person saying both, either or, would cost manpower hours that the board of directors would not understand or approve. So it's an interest in collecting it, but citing very specifically and clearly the limitations or those barriers around manpower hours, and then also communicating it up, which is they wouldn't understand it and they wouldn't approve of it. And if the board of directors is this person's funding source or funding entity, then the need to understand and the need to approve and valorize the work that's happening is really important in this person, and many others were just not seeing that. So kind of the next step, once we had these focus groups and we had these surveys, we talked to hundreds of practitioners at this point, was that we needed to develop use cases, because the point of this grant was to have a formal needs assessment, to say this is where the community is right now and this is where they want to go. And the best way we thought to capture that was in use cases, which were these kind of discrete subject areas from which we could build. And these are the three areas that the community, over a series of focus groups and surveys, identified as the kind of hot spots or hot points that they thought a toolkit should address. The first one was data collection, analysis, and reporting. This was that first bucket. And it really addressed how reuse data is being assembled, interpreted, and communicated to various audiences and stakeholders. And already you're sort of seeing the repetition, right? Because we're going back to the community and we're saying, what else, what else? This communication, this analysis of reuse. The second one was around collection development, and that personally was the most interesting to me, to address how to assess aspects of digital collections based on reuse data. So this also includes things like, what should I buy more of? What should we be prioritizing? What should our marketing team, if we are so lucky to have one, what should they be focusing on? What should we be digitizing first? What should we be going to our funding services and saying, we need this digitized right now, please give us the funding for that. So collection development, broadly speaking, was very important to people. And then finally, privacy, rights management, and ethics. So that implication for ethical collection and distribution of data through the legal, ethical, and culturally aware perspectives was very, very important. And so we use these three use cases as the basis for our second grant. And in 2018, we applied for and received a second IMLS grant that began in 2019. And this one, an equally long name, sorry y'all, is shortened to DCRAFT, Digital Content Reuse Assessment Framework Toolkit. I honestly can't even say it without giggling a little bit because it's just so many words. But this is a 2.5-year grant that we recently received, a National Leadership Grant. It's a longer grant, it's a bigger grant, there's more people involved and there's more deliverables, but really what we're doing is we are trying to use those use cases that we learned, and I'll just double back for a second, that we learned from digital library practitioners 2 years ago to build a toolkit. The project team is almost exactly the same. We dropped one person and added two. Our advisory board, again, are just a series of fairy godmothers who are strengthening our work. They're incredible. I'll just pause so you could see their names. They're from all over. And we also added some consultants. And the reason we added consultants is because the deliverables that we're scheduled to produce for this grant, we're working, the consultants are really helping produce a deeper dive and give us kind of their expertise in some of the areas of importance. So we are working with an assessment consultant, a diversity and equity consultant, especially around those privacy and ethics questions, a privacy consultant, again around those privacy and ethics questions, an instruction consultant who is yet to be named, an accessibility consultant who is also yet to be named, and then one web developer who's helping us put this toolkit, once it's completed, on the web. So the goal of the second grant is to collaboratively develop a toolkit for measuring the reuse of digital assets, so measuring reuse statistics, and facilitating the things that people very early on in 2015 wanted, which was standardization and impact measurement in the digital library field, which really means a clear, agreed upon way of collecting, gathering, identifying, naming, defining, interpreting, analyzing, disseminating data, and then how we talk about our digital library collections or collections generally based on all that stuff that we're gathering. So I didn't know what size the room was going to be, and so I apologize in advance for this slide, but this is our schedule of completion. And what I thought was very clear on the far left-hand side is, from my screen, a very bright pink rectangle that shows all of our deliverables. But I just wanted to take a minute and sort of show you what this looked like. This is a 2.5-year grant mapped out. And what it really looks like is this. So what we are doing is we are creating a code of ethics. Again, privacy, cultural sensitivity, controversial issues of reuse. We are creating recommended practices for communities to rely on or refer to when they're addressing the topic of reuse. We're using the time to create engagement and education tools, so not just creating the practical tools, but then going out and helping people. Like, I don't know if this happens for you, but you hear about lots of things, and then when you want to bring it to your library or to your institution, you're like, I don't even know, how do I start, what do I do, who should I do? It's all of those conversations. And then, of course, we're developing a toolkit and populating that dashboard. So that's what we agreed to do. This is where we are right now, which is the first two. We decided to start with a code of ethics because there were so many questions around data privacy. There were so many questions around cultural sensitivity. In digital libraries, there's a lot of conversations around post-custodial collections, the decolonization of metadata, which is like a whole nother presentation. But a lot of these topics kept coming up in our conversations with practitioners, and we wanted to make sure that we had a framework and a set of just a language, an agreed upon language, before we did anything else, to hold ourselves accountable and then also to hold other practitioners accountable. So I'll just quickly let you know, go back for a second, what we're doing on the Code of Ethics and the recommended practices, and then a little bit towards the future. So right now, the way we work is there's 7 of us on the project team, and then we, kind of like you probably do in your institution, we have these little working groups or task forces that are time-bound. So there's 4 of us working on a code of ethics. We did a massive environmental scan. If anyone has tried to do an environmental scan of codes of ethics, there's a gazillion of them. Like, everyone has one. And it's great. Some are better than others. We're using Zotero for our library to collect all of these. We developed a gauge, which is really like a set of criteria to use when we're reviewing these resources. Originally we thought, oh, we'll develop our own, and then we realized, no. There's really smart people who have created codes of ethics and come up with great language before us, and so we're just trying to see how we can slot into that. We use both like manual work, me reading something, as well as machine readable analysis to start developing patterns, commonly used terms, especially subject headings, etc. And we're going to go back and forth with the advisory board. We're going to get a lot of community feedback. We do that at every single stage. And then we're going to release the Code of Ethics in March of 2020, which is much sooner than I realize. Feels really far. And then this sort of the same thing with the recommended practices, which is the second deliverable. We're trying to have a common understanding of these use cases, and we're creating tagging conventions and guidelines for resources around how to create recommended practices. We're identifying resources to provide content for recommended practices, and there's going to be a section in this larger toolkit that's just devoted to this, recommended practices, best practices, what are other people doing, how are they handling it. A lot of people asked for scripts when there's controversial stuff happening. What do I say to patrons? What do I say to my colleagues? So that's going to all be in there. And we'll have a full release of the recommended practices by December 2020. I mentioned that we started with some definitions, but those are not definitions that, it's sort of tricky when you're in a space and you're like, oh, I want to talk about kind of the murky world of reuse, and then you attempt to define it so that you can set parameters as a group, and then you realize that the definitions were not working with us. And so the definitions that I shared with you in the beginning were the ones that we started with, 2 that we developed, but they have evolved as our projects have evolved. Someone asked if we have had agreement on definitions, and I always say we have not achieved agreement. We are all over the place. Since developing the original definitions, we've modified, and we're constantly thinking about use now, but we're thinking about it now on a spectrum of engagement. So now if you ask us what is the difference between use and reuse, we give you this answer, which is that use is associated with passive consumption of data, number of visitors, downloads, without that context. And that reuse involves a much more complex engagement, a transformative or innovative consumption of that material or of that data. And it's really the complex engagement is enhancing and sharing and in recontextualizing those digital library assets or collections that people are using.
Could you pause on that just a moment?
Yes. I actually just have one more slide and then I can open up to questions. Can you keep your question?
Sure.
You got it?
Oh, I just wanted to look at the slide.
Oh, pause on it. Okay, you didn't have a question on it yet. And I can double back to it too.
Thank you.
Yeah, please. So I really just have one more question and then I would love to, or one more slide and then I'd love to open it up for conversation. So what we're doing now is we're thinking a lot about recontextualization and controversial contexts of these digital library materials. We're thinking a lot about platforms and the interoperability of platforms, collecting use and reuse statistics. They really need to keep up with the needs of practitioners. It's always, I hate when researchers are far ahead of me and I'm like, I don't have the tools yet and your research project is so great. And that's kind of where we are in the digital library world with regard to reuse statistics, where people are starting to collect it and they have really great ideas, but the platforms aren't quite there to be capturing it and interpreting it in a way that they are interested in. So really, we need to get better at demanding those features from vendors and from working together on a shared research agenda. The concept of storytelling is one that's really popular these days. So storytelling or other methods of demonstrating value and impact is vital. I think for probably all of us in this room, the value of a digital library, the labor it takes to collect statistics. If any of you are doing assessment, and I've met some of you earlier, and I know that you are, sometimes it can be really laborious. Assessment is really hard, and really that contribution within an institutional context. And then finally, we've talked a lot about privacy and reuse, both in our focus groups, in our surveys, candidly, formally, informally, over drinks, over coffee. We talk about it all the time. We've seen so many ideas about these topics as librarians and as a research team, and the question we keep coming back to really is it inevitable that some aspect of privacy will be lost in the context of reuse? And if so, what does that mean for us? Okay, thank you so much for listening. So I think we have maybe about 10 minutes. Who has questions? Who has, if you don't have questions for me, I might have questions for you.
I have one question.
Yeah.
I was wondering, in both grant situations, how did you win the participation of the advisory board and the consultants?
Mm-hmm.
Was it just they're participating in a wonderful effort, or are they compensated, or how does that work?
Yeah, it was a combination. So we do everything as much as we can by consensus, and so we each came up with a list of people who we thought were leaders in the field, who could really get us to the next level. We're a project team and we talk all the time, but we needed people outside to help us really shape a much smarter agenda and set of deliverables. And so we came up with a list of really smart people who we admire, people whose Twitter feeds we follow, etc. And then we asked them. They are getting very modestly compensated. I'll tell you that. They're not in it for the money. So, but really it was telling them the story of the work that we're doing and how it really is on the precipice of much bigger changes, and if they wanted to be part of it in some way, we'd love to have them. And I think we have 8 for this grant, and I think we had 7 for the first grant, and I would say almost every single person we asked said yes. Those who said no, it was because of time constraints. You know, people are really busy. So.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. The very top people are besieged all the time
All the
with
time.
the opportunities.
Yeah, there were some instances where a name came up and we thought, ooh, I think they're already on like 4 advisory boards and they're doing this and this and this all off the corner of their desks, like it's not even their day job. So we try to be very careful of labor, just sort of how much we're asking people to do.
Yeah.
Good question. Any other questions? Hi.
Hi, your work is very similar to the same questions that we're asking about research. So have you looked at research metrics, like how a journal is cited and all metrics and so forth?
Yeah, we are looking very, very closely at that, and some of those questions are very much aligned. And so we're gaining a lot of insight from the research, the questions around the research life cycle and the research output. And then some of the examples of reuse touch on, like of the Venn diagram, are very much on that research side. Yeah. So actually, there's a number of presentations here this week that I'm interested in going to, just to try to catch even how they're framing things or the language that they're using around research metrics. So yeah, yes, smart idea. Anything else? So can I ask you a question in the 3 minutes we have left? Do you collect reuse statistics in your worlds, wherever you may be, in libraries, geographically? Does anyone do it? Hey.
In our digital library, the person in charge there is trying to collect whatever statistics he can get from citations and things where we find the content that we know we're housing, but it's very hit or miss. It's not any kind of standardized from something we'd like to do more of. I was curious to see that you guys this is being worked on.
We have found that so much too, which is that it's either manual or sort of pulled together, and then questions of like sustainability and reliability or reproducibility are just, you can't even ask the questions because you're like, no, I can't, it's not quite going to work. But I really hope that we're getting to a place where someone like you can say like to your stakeholders at Villanova, like this is an important aspect of all the work that we're doing. This is a digital library context, but I think it's very easily transferable to many other contexts where people are collecting usage data and trying to tell a compelling story around it, or trying to make acquisitions decisions, or staffing decisions, or digitization priorities. Okay, great. Well, thank you very, very much, and I hope you have a great rest of your conference.
Thanks.